Hello, and welcome to Nightly History. Tonight we will travel together to the heart of an ancient kingdom, a place where the morning never truly ends. Imagine yourself standing on a wide plain before sunrise. The air is cool, almost weightless, touched by the scent of clay and river mist. Somewhere nearby, a bell rings, soft, distant, and the sound drifts like breath through the half-light. Ahead of you lies the Irrawaddy, still and silent, its waters turning gold even before the sun has risen. And beyond it, shapes begin to emerge from the mist. Thousands of towers, domes and spires, each one holding the first light of day like a memory made of stone. This is Bagan, a city of temples of prayers turned into architecture, a sea of red and ochre stretching to the horizon. For nearly 1,000 years, it has waited beneath this sky, where every grain of sand was once part of a wall, a statue, or a dream. You can almost hear the murmurs of monks moving through the dust, their robes brushing softly against the wind, their voices low, carrying verses older than the language of kings. Here, devotion was not spoken, it was built. Each pagoda was a promise, each brick a small confession of faith. Kings offered gold, farmers offered labour, and the earth itself gave shape to their belief that time could be touched through prayer. When travellers first see Bagan, they often fall silent. The sight feels less like discovery and more like remembrance, as if some part of you has been here before, waiting to return. And when the sun finally rises, spilling light across the plain, it touches thousands of temples at once, and for a single, breathless moment, the past and present fold together. Time kneels. Tonight, let us walk together among these temples, through stories of kings and monks, of faith and fall, of dust and dawn. Let us listen to the silence that still lingers after centuries of prayer, and perhaps, by the end of this journey, we will understand why, in Bagan, the dawn, like faith, never truly ends. Long before there was a kingdom, long before the word Bagan was ever spoken, there was only the plain, a vast, sun-bleached emptiness stretching between the highlands of the north and the delta of the south, a place where wind had more stories than men. When dawn touched this land, it did not rise over towers or gilded roofs. It rose over grass that whispered like waves, over the slow curve of the Irrawaddy River gliding through haze. The air trembled with heat even before noon, and when the rain came, it came like forgiveness, brief, heavy, and gone again. Those who wandered here left almost nothing behind. The river changed its course from century to century, hiding traces of their footsteps beneath silt and time. Yet beneath the dust lay the seeds of devotion, waiting for a people who would one day give them form. The earliest voices belong to the Pew, a people who built walled cities of brick and silence. They spoke a tongue now lost, worshipped both spirits and the Buddha, and carved stupas that face the same rising sun that still shines today. Their cities, Sri Ksetra, Baek Thano, Harlin, were scattered across the plains like constellations in clay. When these cities fell to invaders and time, the knowledge they carried drifted north with refugees, finding shelter near the great curve of the Irrawaddy. There, on higher ground, safe from flood and war, the first foundations of Bagan were set, not yet royal, not yet sacred, merely human. No one knows their names, no chronicles remember their faces. But if you walk the dry soil after rain, you might find fragments of their pottery glinting in the sun. A small piece of red earth, polished by centuries, still bearing the print of a hand that shaped it. The land remembers, quietly. Each grain of sand once part of something larger, a vessel, a wall, a home. Each whisper of wind carries a faint echo of chants long extinguished. The Irrawaddy is not a single river, but a memory of many. It begins in the far north, where snowmelt trickles through jade-green valleys, and ends in a delta wider than some seas. In between, it becomes a moving mirror for 1,000 lives. It was the river that first called settlers here. It offered water, fish, fertile banks, and a road to everywhere. To follow it was to trace the line between survival and oblivion. At dawn, the fishermen's boats would slide out silently, each oar breaking the reflection of clouds. By dusk, they returned carrying the shimmer of scales, tiny offerings from the river to the people who called it mother. Even now, when you stand on its banks, you can feel how it breathes, a long, slow rhythm older than language. The wind too was a teacher. It brought the smell of faraway forests, the cry of cranes, the taste of salt from distant seas. In its song, the early settlers heard omens, blessings, warnings, the laughter of unseen spirits. They learned to build their homes low to the ground, walls thick against dust, roofs curved like palms pressed together in prayer. They watched how the wind bent the trees and followed its direction when planting, believing it carried the breath of the gods. Before the Buddha came, this was a land of gnats, spirits born from mountains, rivers, and human sorrow. Each hill had its guardian, each tree its whispering soul. When storms destroyed a hut, the people left offerings of rice and oil on the threshold, asking forgiveness from whatever they had offended. These rituals did not vanish when Buddhism arrived. They folded into it, like old roots beneath new blossoms. The Pew, and later the Burmans who followed, were not strangers to faith. Their world was alive, every rock and ripple an expression of something sacred. The idea that the divine could dwell in form was not foreign. It was inevitable. Perhaps that is why, centuries later, this same plain would become a forest of temples, the earth simply continuing its habit of devotion. Sometime around the 9th century, new settlers came from the north, the Burmans. They were hardy, pragmatic, their speech carrying tones of Tibeto-Burman hills. They followed their herds down the river valleys, bringing with them the fire of their ancestors and the memory of walled cities. When they reached this dry heartland, they found ruins, fertile soil, and space enough to dream. At first they built fortifications, not temples. The land was contested. Pew remnants, Mon traders from the south, Shan chieftains from the east. But amid these struggles, something deeper was happening. Ideas travelled with merchants, scrolls written in Pali, stories of the Buddha, relics said to contain his breath. From Thaton and the coast came monks, whose robes were the colour of sunset, carrying teachings that spoke not of conquest but of release. The Burmans listened. In a world of war and drought, the promise of peace through understanding was as precious as water. So when the warrior chieftain, Pian Baya, fortified a settlement near the bend of the Irrawaddy in the year 849, he was doing more than founding a city. He was setting the stage for transformation. What began as a fortress would become a mandala of faith. Stone by stone, prayer by prayer, the plain began to awaken. The soil of central Myanmar holds a secret. It is perfect for brick. When mixed with straw and sun, it hardens into something that can endure centuries of rain and fire. The early builders discovered this by chance, shaping small stupas and homes that withstood monsoon after monsoon. Soon, brick became more than material. It became language. To build was to speak to eternity. The people here learned to bake their faith into form. They stacked devotion in tiers, each layer rising closer to heaven. Even the smallest village shrine mirrored the universe in miniature. Square base for earth, rounded dome for water, tapering spire for air and fire, the unseen pinnacle for spirit. When dawn touched these shapes, the bricks glowed like embers, and the whole plain seemed to breathe. By the 10th century, caravans moved regularly along the river. From the south came the Mon, skilled in writing and sculpture. From the west, traders from Bengal. From the east, whispers of the great Khmer Empire. Every encounter left a trace, a motif, a word, a style of arch or ornament. The Burmans absorbed them all. Bagan, though not yet a capital, was already becoming a crossroads of art and belief. Archaeologists today find Mon inscriptions beside pew symbols, Pali prayers beside local incantations. It was not confusion but harmony, a polyphony of cultures learning to sing together. Out of that chorus would soon rise a single, resonant note, the sound of a kingdom finding its faith. History often records the moment of victory, but rarely the long quiet that comes before it. For more than a century, this land waited. Seasons passed, the river rose and fell, dynasties elsewhere burned and were forgotten. Yet here, the people continued to shape brick, to plant, to pray. They were building not for glory, but for belonging. Imagine standing on that plain 1,000 years ago. The air hums with cicadas. Smoke from cooking fires drifts upward in thin blue lines. Somewhere, a monk recites verses under his breath, while children chase each other through dust. The horizon is unbroken. No palace, no spire, only the faint promise of one. And above it all, the sky. Vast, unjudging, eternal. What does such silence dream of? Perhaps of endurance, perhaps of a city that would one day mirror the heavens themselves. In that silence, the idea of Bagan was already forming, not as an act of empire, but as a collective exhale of faith. By the late 10th century, the plain had become dense with villages. Canals cut through the fields, storing rainwater for the long dry season. Travellers spoke of a settlement where monks and merchants shared the same wells. The locals called it Pukum, or Pagan, the place of the dry land, or perhaps the place where wishes rise like heat from the earth. Its walls were modest, its rulers unknown outside their own horizon. But something was stirring within. Every festival, every chant at the full moon, every small pagoda built in gratitude was a step toward the city that would soon awaken. And so the centuries turned. The pew faded into memory. The Mon arrived with their scripts. The Burmans wove both into their tongue. The land, once merely a stage for survival, became a sanctuary for belief. Where others saw dust, these people saw clay, and in clay, the potential for eternity. When the first king of true renown, Anaurachta, finally rose from this soil, he would inherit not emptiness, but preparation. He would find a people already speaking in the language of devotion, a river that knew how to guide faith, and a plain that had long been waiting to bloom into stone. But that will come later. For now, the plain still sleeps under a soft curtain of dawn. The river turns once more in its bed. Somewhere, a heron lifts its wings, scattering mist into gold. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the murmur of the first prayer ever spoken here, a whisper carried by wind and time, the sound of a civilization inhaling before its first breath. And in that breath, the story of Bagan begins. By the 10th century, the Irrawaddy Plain had learned the rhythm of life, the rise and fall of floods, the slow carving of riverbanks, the turning of seasons between dust and green. Villages dotted the horizon like beads on a thread of water. In the evening, smoke rose from clay stoves, and the air filled with the smell of sesame oil and wet soil. The people had endured, quietly, stubbornly, waiting for someone to give their endurance a name. That name was Anaurachta. But before him came many whose stories are half legend, half truth. Warrior chiefs who built fortresses, kings whose reigns lasted the span of a drought, monks who carried relics through the night. Bagan, still a small settlement by the Irrawaddy, was one among many. Yet it possessed something the others did not, a view of the river that caught both sunrise and sunset. It sat at the heart of the land like a lung, breathing in caravans from the north and prayers from the south. The chronicles say that when King Pinbia fortified this place in 849 CE, he surrounded it with walls of brick and hope. Within them lay fields of millet, storehouses, and shrines to the Nats. Outside stretched the endless plain, dry but fertile, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. His descendants ruled in relative obscurity. Their names flicker across stone inscriptions like faint stars before dawn. The world beyond Bagan, however, was stirring. To the south, the Mon Kingdom of Thaton flourished, rich with trade and Theravada scriptures brought from Sri Lanka and India. To the east, the Khmer Empire was raising towers toward the heavens. To the west, the Bengal ports echoed with the chants of monks and merchants. And to the north, the highlands carried whispers of nomadic powers soon to descend. Between them all lay this plain, neither fully conquered nor fully free. Its fate would depend on who could unite its dust into destiny. Anaurachta was born into a time of unrest, around 1014 CE. The chronicles describe him as fierce in youth, silent in maturity, a man who understood both the sword and the sutra. His father, King Kunsar Kyongpyu, ruled briefly before being deposed by his own sons-in-law. When Anaurachta returned to reclaim the throne, he did so not just by force but by faith. He is said to have prayed before battle, offering his victory to the Buddha. When he entered Bagan as king in 1044, he vowed to build a realm worthy of the Dharma, and so began the transformation of a fortress town into the spiritual heart of Myanmar. The chronicles tell of his first decree, "Let every stone speak of merit." He believed that a kingdom could endure only if founded upon compassion, that conquest without virtue was emptiness. Yet he was no monk king, cloistered in contemplation. Anaurachta understood power, and he wielded it with precision. He reformed the army, the taxation, the irrigation. He built reservoirs and canals that still feed the plain today. Under his rule, the dry land began to bloom, but his greatest conquest would not be of soil or silver, it would be of the soul. At that time, the teachings of Theravada Buddhism, the southern school that traced its lineage to the island of Lanka, were flourishing in the Mon Kingdom of Thaton. Its capital was said to hold 1,000 monks and libraries filled with Pali scriptures written on palm leaves, bound in lacquered wood. Anaurachta, hungry for spiritual legitimacy, sent envoys to request copies of these texts. The Mon King Manuha refused, claiming that the sacred words should not leave their homeland. So Anaurachta marched south. The story, half history and half myth, says that his army carried not only swords, but ox-drawn carts laden with bricks, to build pagodas along the way, each victory sanctified by construction. The march lasted months. The Mon soldiers, brave but few, could not withstand the Burman tide. When Thaton fell in 1057, Anaurachta did not burn it. He gathered its monks, artisans, and scribes, and brought them north, 20,000 captives of faith, carrying with them the Pali Canon and the art of building in stone. Among the treasures was said to be a sacred relic, a tooth of the Buddha, which Anaurachta enshrined in the Lorcananda Pagoda, still standing on the riverbank today, gleaming gold above the water like a captured sunrise. With that victory, the spirit of the South merged with the body of the North. The fusion of Mon scholarship and Burman power gave birth to a civilization unlike any other in Southeast Asia, one that measured its wealth not in gold, but in devotion. Back in Bagan, the transformation began. Mon craftsmen introduced new techniques: vaulted corridors, graceful arches, glazed tiles, and stucco reliefs depicting the Jishe Jataka tales. The Pew tradition of small stupas expanded into grand temples that mirrored the cosmic mountain Meru. Anaurachta ordered the construction of the Shwezigon Pagoda, its gilded bell-shaped dome rising above the plain. Legend says it was built to enshrine bones and teeth of the Buddha, gathered from across his realm. The king himself supervised its placement, choosing a site where sunlight lingered longest each day. When it was completed, he walked barefoot around its base, head bowed, as monks chanted verses carried by the wind. It was more than a monument, it was a declaration that faith would be the mortar of his empire. He established monasteries that doubled as schools, where monks taught literacy, law and medicine. Farmers donated part of their harvest to sustain the Sangha. Artisans crafted statues whose serene faces mirrored the stillness they sought within. Bagan's economy flourished not through conquest but through merit. Every act of generosity believed to yield blessings, both seen and unseen. The king's court was a circle of learning. Monks from Sri Lanka debated with scholars from Bengal. The Pali language became the bridge between tribes. Inscriptions carved into stone recorded donations, prayers and dreams, the first written Burmese language taking form in these carvings. In time, even the humblest villager sought to leave behind a brick inscribed with his name, a token of faith baked into the city's very skin. With faith came unity. The Irrawaddy Valley, once a mosaic of rival chiefdoms, now flowed toward Bagan like tributaries to a greater river. Anaurachta extended his reach north to Nanzhao, west to Arakan, east to the Shan Hills. Yet he ruled not by fear but by patronage, granting conquered peoples land for monasteries, inviting their monks to his capital. From afar, envoys from Ceylon and India brought gifts of relics and texts. The king sent back ships of rice and lacquerware, turning faith into diplomacy. Bagan became a centre not just of worship, but of international exchange. Its skyline grew dense with pagodas, each representing a vow, a victory, a life. The people began to believe that the very act of building could lead to enlightenment. Families pooled their savings to sponsor a small stupa. Merchants funded temples that bore their initials. Even soldiers, before campaign, pledged to construct shrines if they returned alive. And so the city expanded, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, until the horizon itself seemed to kneel beneath its weight. But where there is devotion, there is also pride. Anaurachta's successors inherited his faith, but not always his humility. The desire to outshine predecessors led to grander, heavier temples, feats of engineering that tested the limits of earth and labour. Under King Kyanzittha, the Ananda temple rose, a masterpiece of geometry and grace. Its corridors glowed with the light of morning. Its 4 standing Buddhas gazed serenely toward the cardinal directions, symbolizing infinite compassion. Yet behind such beauty lay endless toil. Thousands of workers labored in heat and dust, singing hymns to keep rhythm as they lifted bricks shaped by hands that would never be remembered. Still they built, because to build was to believe. The economy revolved around merit. Wealthy families competed not in trade but in temples. Prestige came from how many monks one could feed. The city glittered with offerings: gold leaf, incense, robes, each a tangible wish for salvation. Bagan's skyline became a scripture written in architecture, Shwezigon for the king's piety, Ananda for wisdom, That Biinyu for enlightenment, Dharmayangi for penance. Each temple spoke a different language, but together they recited one truth, that faith could take form and that form could defy time. History often praises kings and architects, but Bagan was also the work of countless unknown souls, the potters who mixed clay with ash, the boatmen who ferried bricks across the river, the novices who swept temple floors at dawn. Their devotion was quiet but enduring. A woman might sell her jewellery to buy a handful of gold leaf to press onto a Buddha's cheek. A farmer might donate his oxen for a day of hauling stone. Each act, however small, was recorded in heaven's ledger, or so they believed. At dusk, when the sun turned the plain into molten amber, villagers gathered to light oil lamps around the pagodas. The flames trembled in the wind, reflected 1,000-fold on gilded surfaces. From afar, it looked as though the earth itself was burning, not with destruction, but with devotion. That light, more than the crowns of kings, became the soul of Bagan. Anaurachta's reign lasted 33 years. He died around 1077, while travelling near the northern frontiers, some say struck by a wild buffalo, others by betrayal. His body was never found, but the people said that when he fell, the earth shook, and a new pagoda rose where his blood touched the ground. In death, as in life, he became legend, the Dhammaraja, the righteous king who turned dust into sanctity. His successors would carry his dream forward, each adding another layer to the city's endless dawn. By the 12th century, Bagan was no longer a mere capital. It was a cosmos of faith, a mirror of the heavens, a testimony carved in red earth. Pilgrims from distant lands approached it as one approaches a holy mountain, slowly, reverently, aware that they were entering not just a city, but a state of grace. If you could have stood on the hill of Tuyintang one morning in that age, you would have seen a sight unlike any other on earth. The river curled like a silver serpent, the fields shimmered with dew, and between them, thousands of stupas pierced the mist, their golden spires catching the first rays of sun. The sound of bells drifted from every direction, not in unison, but in harmony. This was Bagan at the moment of awakening, the breath that follows the long inhale of history. Each morning felt like creation anew. Each evening, as the light faded, the bricks glowed as though remembering the hands that had shaped them. For the people who lived here, time itself had become circular. Every dawn a reminder of rebirth, every temple a prayer cast into permanence. Bagan was born, not in a single year, but across generations of faith. It rose from conquest, but its foundations were mercy. It was the meeting point of many rivers, of culture, belief, and longing, converging into one vast sea of devotion. The plain that had once lain silent now spoke with 1,000 voices, each echoing the same vow, that even in a world of impermanence, something of goodness could endure. And so, the city took its first full breath. Brick by brick, chant by chant, Bagan entered history, a city built not merely to live, but to remember. When Anaurachta's bones had long turned to dust and legend, the city he founded began to breathe on its own. Faith had become its pulse, brick had become its language, and devotion, endless, luminous devotion, had become its art. Bagan entered what later generations would call the Golden Age, a time when the sun seemed to rise only to illuminate its temples. From the river to the farthest dunes, from the palace walls to the outer villages, the plain glittered with towers. By the 12th century, there were said to be more than 10,000 monuments, pagodas, stupas, monasteries, and shrines, each carrying a story, each shaped by a hand that believed in something beyond itself. It was an age when time slowed, when the line between heaven and earth blurred, and when the quiet rhythm of prayer became the music of a civilization. Morning in Bagan was a ceremony in itself. Before the first rooster crowed, the bells of the monasteries began to ring. The sound moved across the plain like ripples in a lake. Monks wrapped in robes the colour of marigolds emerged from their huts, bowls in hand, walking barefoot through the mist. Villagers waited at doorways, heads bowed, offering rice, flowers, and whispers of gratitude. Above them the temples caught the light, red brick glowing amber, gold leaf shimmering like fire. From the air, the city must have looked like a field of embers scattered by the gods. There was no centre and no edge. The palace itself, though grand, was overshadowed by the temples around it. In Bagan, even kings lived beneath the gaze of the Buddha. When the sun rose, it was not a single dawn, but 10,000 dawns, each reflecting off a different stupa. From every spire drifted the faint scent of incense, mingled with the cries of cranes and the sound of chanting. For the people of Bagan, faith was not confined to monasteries. It filled the air they breathed. After Anaurachta came kings who saw in him both example and challenge. They built not to surpass him, but to continue what he had begun, the conversation between earth and sky. Under King Kyanzittha, 1084 to 1113, Bagan reached its artistic zenith. He was a man of vision, both warrior and poet, who understood that the true measure of power was beauty. Kyanzittha commissioned the Ananda Temple, one of the most perfect structures ever built in Asia. They say he dreamed of a snow-white mountain from the Himalayas, the mythical Nandamula cave where the Buddha once taught, and ordered his architects to recreate it in stone. The result was breathtaking. Symmetrical corridors, shining stupas, and 4 colossal Buddhas facing the 4 directions, each gesture a different expression of serenity. When you walk through Ananda today, light spills through perforated stone windows in shifting patterns, as if time itself were kneeling. The scent of old dust mingles with candle smoke. Even the silence has texture. This was the heart of the Golden Age, where architecture became meditation, where geometry and grace met in perfect balance. Bagan's artists were not mere craftsmen. They were translators of devotion. Every surface of every temple was alive with meaning. Walls became scriptures, arches became prayers, domes became metaphors for the universe. Frescoes told stories of the Buddha's previous lives. The Jataka tales, painted in pigments made from crushed minerals and ash. Look closely, and you can still see the brushstrokes. Elephants and kings, forests and celestial beings, rivers that shimmer with imagined light. These were not scenes of other worlds, but reflections of their own. The people of Bagan painting themselves into eternity. The artisans who carved the faces of the Buddhas gave them expressions that were neither joy nor sorrow, but something deeper, an understanding that all things rise and fall like breath. Each temple had its own personality. Shwezigon, gilded and radiant, spoke of royal devotion. Ananda, pale and geometric, whispered of wisdom. That Byinyu, tall and slender, represented enlightenment. Dhammayangi, massive and dark, carried the weight of penance. Together they formed a theology of stone, an unspoken dialogue about the many ways humans seek the divine. If the kings were the patrons, The monks were the architects of the soul. Their monasteries became libraries of palm leaf manuscripts, where the teachings of the Buddha were copied by hand. Ink was made from soot and tamarind. The script flowed like water across the page. At night, the monks read by the glow of oil lamps, their voices blending into the hum of crickets and the sigh of the wind. The whole plain seemed to breathe with them, inhaling, exhaling, chanting. These monasteries were not isolated cloisters. They were schools, hospitals, and centres of charity. The monks advised kings, settled disputes, taught children to read. They were the moral compass of the realm, a reminder that even power must bow before compassion. Kyanzittha, like Anaurachta before him, saw himself as a protector of the Dharma. He invited monks from Sri Lanka to purify the faith, ensuring that Theravada Buddhism remained its guiding light. In return, the island sent relics, pieces of bone and hair said to belong to the Buddha himself, which were enshrined in the new temples. In those exchanges, faith became diplomacy, and Bagan became a beacon across the Buddhist world. While kings and monks shaped destiny, it was the ordinary people who filled the plain with life. Farmers rose before dawn, their feet sinking into dust cool from the night. They tilled fields watered by canals first dug under Anaurachta's reign, the same canals that still shimmer like veins across the landscape. In the dry months, they carried baskets of clay to the kilns, helping to bake the bricks that would form the next pagoda. Each brick bore a mark, sometimes a simple fingerprint, sometimes a carved prayer. It was said that to touch such a brick was to touch the promise of rebirth. Merchants traded lacquerware, cotton, and salt along the Irrawaddy. Caravans came from China with jade, from Bengal with spices, from the Andaman coast with pearls. Each new arrival added a thread to the tapestry of Bagan's wealth. And yet, even amid prosperity, life was modest. The people measured fortune not by coins, but by merit, by how much they gave, not how much they kept. When the harvest was good, families funded the repair of an old shrine. When a child recovered from illness, a new pagoda rose. Faith was both celebration and currency, binding all lives in a circle of gratitude. As the centuries turned, the skyline thickened with monuments. Seen from the hills, Bagan resembled an ocean of stupas, waves of brick frozen in motion. Each was unique. Some were round like the sun, others square like the earth. Some reached high and slender, others sat low and solid, their domes echoing the horizon's curve. In the monsoon, the rain darkened them to deep crimson. In the dry season, they glowed ochre under a merciless sky, and when dusk came, their shadows stretched like fingers across the ground, a silent hymn written by light. The air smelled of clay, oil and incense. Birds nested in niches once holding statues. Monks recited sutras to the rhythm of cicadas. Every moment, something was being built, repaired, blessed, or reborn. Bagan had become a living mandala, a diagram of the universe, both fragile and eternal. News of Bagan's splendour spread across lands and seas. Travellers from India, China, and Sri Lanka wrote of its vastness, its endless temples, its quiet discipline. Unlike the courts of other empires, Bagan's glory was not marble or conquest, but the serene weight of brick. Yet beyond its borders, the world was restless. To the west, the Cholas raided coasts. To the north, new tribes moved across the mountains. To the east, Angkor's towers mirrored Bagan's own ambitions. The Irrawaddy kingdom watched them all, calm but vigilant. The kings of Bagan sent envoys, exchanged gifts, and sometimes armies. But within its heart, the rhythm remained unchanged. monks at dawn, bells at dusk, prayers circling the temples like wind through reeds. It was as if Bagan existed on a different axis of time, untouched by haste. Every golden age casts a shadow. For Bagan, it came under King Narathu, 1167 to 1170, whose reign was brief and dark. He built the Damayangi temple, the largest and most imposing of all, a pyramid of red brick so perfectly fitted that even a needle could not slip between the stones. They say he ordered it built to atone for his sins, the murder of his father, his brother, and a queen from Ceylon. He demanded perfection from his masons, executing any who left gaps in the mortar. The temple was never finished. Its inner corridors were sealed, its windows bricked over, as though the building itself could not bear its maker's guilt. Today, when the wind passes through Damayangi, it moans softly, echoing like a distant chant. The sound of repentance turned to architecture. Even in its darkness, it belongs to the Golden Age, proof that faith and flaw are inseparable, that even sin sought salvation in Bagan. What united every king, every builder, every believer was the conviction that enlightenment was not a metaphor, but a direction, east, where the sun rises. All temples were built to face that light. At dawn, beams entered their corridors, striking statues in gold. The walls glowed, the Buddhas seemed to breathe. The people said that if one stood in silence at that moment, one could feel the entire city exhale. In this ritual, Bagan transcended religion. It became an act of meditation performed by the earth itself. From the riverbanks to the highest hills, everything existed for that one purpose: to catch the sun, to turn dust into radiance. If morning belonged to monks, dusk belonged to memory. As the sun descended, the plain turned to bronze. Farmers bathed in the river, washing away the day's labour. Bells chimed from the hilltop pagodas. The sky darkened from gold to violet. Fires appeared one by one in the courtyards. From afar, they looked like constellations fallen to earth. The people sat outside, eating in silence, watching the silhouettes of temples fade into the gathering night. Above them, the moon rose, silvering the domes. Dogs barked in the distance. Somewhere, a flute played. The whole plain seemed suspended between prayer and dream. And in that stillness, Bagan felt eternal, a city that no longer belonged to any king, but to the rhythm of existence itself. Centuries would pass, kings would rise and fall, but in this age, the foundations were set, not only of architecture, but of identity. Bagan had become more than a capital. It was the mirror in which a people saw their soul. Each dawn repeated the same promise. That light, once born, need not fade. That even in a world of impermanence, beauty could persist, not by resisting time, but by surrendering to it. The monks called it anicca, the truth of transience. Yet Bagan, in its paradox, made impermanence beautiful. Its temples were not built to defy decay, but to remind the living that even decay could be sacred. And so the city glowed through the centuries, like a lamp sheltered from the wind, fragile, flickering, but never extinguished. For this was its golden age, a time when the heart of a nation beat in rhythm with the bells of its temples, when kings knelt beside monks, when the sun itself seemed to pause over the Irrawaddy, unwilling to leave, the age when Bagan believed that dawn, like faith, could truly never end. When the wind calms and the bells fall silent, Bagan begins to whisper. It is not the sound of the city outside, but of the temples within, the slow creak of ancient wood, the flutter of a bat in the rafters, the sigh of dust shifting in a shaft of light. It is in these quiet hours, between dawn and the first footstep of pilgrims, that one can feel the heart of Bagan still beating. To walk among its temples is to move through layers of breath, each wall a lung of history, each chamber an echo of prayer. The world outside may belong to kings and conquests, but in here, time kneels. The first thing you notice is the air, cool, dry, touched with the faint sweetness of incense and clay. It carries the scent of centuries, oil smoke, sandalwood, the iron tang of old metal bells. Your eyes take time to adjust. What from the outside seems solid and heavy becomes a lattice of light. Rays slip through tiny perforations in the brick, not harsh, but gentle, filtered by dust that turns sunlight into visible breath. It drifts, moves, and disappears, like thought itself. Inside the Ananda temple, the air moves in slow circles. Every corridor bends towards silence. On the walls, faded frescoes trace the Jataka tales, the Buddha's previous lives, painted by hands that knew neither vanity nor hurry. A deer glances backward. A prince offers his body to a starving tigress. A mother weeps beneath a Bodhi tree. These stories do not shout. They hum beneath the skin of the temple, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. At the center, 4 colossal Buddhas stand facing the 4 directions. Their eyes are half closed, their lips slightly curved, not in smile or sorrow, but in knowing. When the morning light reaches them, it touches their brows one by one, as though blessing the earth itself. Even when the tourists have left, even when the candles burn low, that light continues to travel, bouncing from wall to wall, a quiet, endless procession of dawn. Every temple speaks, but never in words. Its language is the alignment of corridors, the echo of footsteps, the weight of shadow. Walk long enough, and you realize that the builders of Bagan understood silence better than any architect since. The walls absorb sound until even your own heartbeat feels intrusive. A whisper can travel the length of a hallway and return changed, lower, slower, as though aged by the journey. When you stop, the silence folds around you like a second robe. Monks say this is the true purpose of a temple. Not to teach, but to remind. To remind you how small you are, how vast stillness can be, and how faith is not the opposite of doubt, but its quiet companion. Sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear another rhythm, the low, continuous hum of bees nesting in the upper vaults. Their droning merges with the faint vibration of the earth, and for a moment you cannot tell which belongs to nature and which to prayer. Even now, centuries after the kings have turned to dust, the monks remain. They are the keepers of time. At dawn they move through the temples barefoot, sweeping leaves from the steps, lighting candles whose flames tremble in the morning wind. Their robes catch the light, a slow wave of amber moving across stone. Inside, they chant. The Pali syllables rise and fall like the tide, carrying meanings older than empire. Sabbe Sankara Anika. All things are impermanent. The sound fills the corridors, slips through cracks in the walls, and seeps into the ground. In Bagan, prayer is not confined to mouths. It lives in the earth itself. At noon, when the heat is fierce, the monks sit in shadow, eating from bowls of rice and lentils. They speak little. Their discipline is not about denial, but attentiveness. The ability to taste every grain, to hear every bird, to see each flicker of flame without claiming it. When evening comes, they walk again, this time carrying lamps. The light wavers along the temple walls, revealing murals of long-forgotten faces, donors, dancers, kings, craftsmen, all gazing toward the same center, all waiting for enlightenment. To understand the heart of devotion, one must understand the hands that shaped it. In Bagan's workshops, art was not signed because all creation was offering. The sculptors believed that to carve the Buddha's face was an act of meditation. Each chisel marked a breath, each contour a surrender of the self. Painters ground minerals into powder, mixing them with tamarind sap and cow bile to make colours that could endure the ages. Their reds came from iron oxide, their blues from lapis, brought by traders over mountains, their gold from dust beaten out of coins by hammer and faith. They worked mostly by candlelight. Every movement cast new shadows, revealing shapes that might have been missed in full sun. In that half-light, art and worship became one. There was no distance between devotion and craft. A potter moulding clay for roof tiles would whisper a prayer into each one. A mason laying bricks would pause to press his thumb against the mortar, a small human signature, invisible but eternal. Even the mistakes were sacred. A line drawn slightly askew, a proportion imperfect, none were corrected, for perfection was reserved for the divine. To be slightly flawed was to be human, and therefore closer to truth. Faith was not the privilege of the wealthy. It flowed through every hand that touched the city. Fishermen offered the first catch of the season to the monasteries. Farmers built tiny shrines at the corners of their fields, each topped with a bowl for birds and a candle for spirits. Widows sat at temple gates, weaving garlands for statues. Children recited verses while their mothers made arms for monks. During festival days, the plain shimmered with colour. Caravans from distant villages arrived, carrying offerings wrapped in banana leaves, rice cakes, jasmine, honey. Drums echoed through the dust. Pilgrims circled the pagodas 3 times clockwise, their lips moving in silent vows. At night, when oil lamps were lit along every terrace, the city seemed to float, an island of fire adrift in a sea of darkness. To walk among those lamps was to feel the heartbeat of Bagan itself, each flame a soul, each flicker a prayer, and all of them together forming one vast constellation of faith. The great temples were more than architecture. They were maps of the universe. The base symbolized the world of men, square, solid, grounded in earth. Above rose terraces representing the heavens, ascending toward the spire, the axis of enlightenment. At the very top, hidden within the finial, relics were sealed, sacred hair, bones, or fragments of scripture. Thus, to walk through a temple was to journey from the human to the divine. The outer halls depicted worldly life, markets, festivals, wars. The inner chambers told stories of compassion and renunciation. And at the core, beyond all decoration, sat the Buddha, silent, immovable, radiant. The path inward mirrored the path of meditation, from distraction to clarity, from noise to stillness, from self to surrender. Visitors entered through sunlight and emerged into shadow, only to find that the light they sought had been inside all along. This was the philosophy of Bagan, enlightenment not as escape but as return. Among the hundreds that still stand, one holds a special kind of silence, the Dhammayangyi Temple. It looms above the plain like a wounded heart, its corridors sealed, its bricks pressed so tightly that no knife can slide between them. Legend says King Narathu built it to cleanse his sins, to atone for murder and betrayal. He demanded absolute perfection. Those who failed were executed, their bodies entombed within the walls. The temple, they say, was cursed from the beginning. But time has softened its cruelty. Today, birds nest in its towers, and wildflowers grow between the stones. What was once built from guilt has become a sanctuary of quiet forgiveness. The wind that passes through its empty halls sounds almost like chanting. Even the shadows seem to pray. Bagan teaches that nothing is beyond redemption, that even darkness, when held long enough to the sun, begins to glow. Every afternoon, the sun begins its descent over the Irrawaddy, turning the temples into silhouettes against a sky of burning gold. It is the hour when devotion changes form. Monks return from alms rounds, villagers bring water to the roots of sacred trees, and the air fills with the murmur of evening prayers. Children chase kites between the stupas, their laughter mingling with the chant of elders. Somewhere, a conch shell blows, calling the faithful to meditation. As light fades, the brick turns crimson, then copper, then brown. The Buddha's faces disappear into shadow, but their presence remains, a warmth in the air, a hush in the mind. The lamps are lit again, small fires trembling in the breeze, as if the stars themselves had descended to rest among men. For a few minutes each day, just before darkness settles, the entire plain glows, not with fire, but with reflection. Every temple catches the last sunbeam and returns it softly, like memory. It is as if the city itself is exhaling light. In that breath lies the heart of Bagan's devotion, faith not as demand, but as release. To stand in the middle of Bagan at night is to stand within a galaxy made of earth. The air is still, the horizon infinite. Owls call from the towers, and the Irrawaddy murmurs beyond sight. From every direction rise the outlines of temples, black against the starlit sky. Their forms are so many, so varied, that they seem to merge into one another, a single, sleeping body of stone. It is then you understand that devotion here was never about grandeur, it was about presence. Every pagoda, no matter how small, was built as an eye to heaven, a reminder that the sacred is not distant but near, within the breath of the living. The people of Bagan did not fear time, they befriended it. They offered their labour to it, their art to it, their prayers to it, knowing that it would take everything back, and in return, time gave them immortality. The temples remain because they were never built to last. They were built to love, and love, in its purest form, leaves traces even in dust. When dawn returns, as it always does, the first light slides again across the plains, touching the same spires, awakening the same silence. A monk opens a door, and the smell of oil lamps drifts out. A farmer places a single lotus at the base of a shrine. The river breathes, the wind sighs, and somewhere within that vast chorus of stillness, the heart of Bagan beats once more, slow, steady, eternal. It does not beat for kings or glory. It beats for compassion, for humility, for the fragile beauty of believing in something unseen. For this is the secret that lies within every wall, every statue, every grain of sand in this sacred plain. That devotion is not what we build, but what remains after everything else has fallen away. And as the sun climbs higher, scattering mist into gold, the city of temples awakens again, breathing, glowing, remembering. For 200 years, Bagan had stood like a dream that refused to fade. Its temples glowed each morning beneath a sun that seemed endless. Faith had become its foundation, beauty its language, and silence its crown. But even the most radiant dawn cannot last forever. Time, patient and impartial, was already gathering clouds above the golden plain. The fall of Bagan would not come in a single blow, nor from a single enemy. It would arrive slowly, like dust settling after a storm, through pride and greed, through fire and tremor, through the inevitable sigh of the earth, remembering that all things must end. By the middle of the 13th century, the city had reached a splendour so immense it was almost impossible to sustain. From the riverbanks to the desert edge stretched a forest of temples, thousands upon thousands, their spires piercing the sky. The people believed that each pagoda brought merit not only to its builder, but to all mankind. To stop building would have been to let faith grow silent, and so they built endlessly. Farmers gave their harvests, nobles gave their fortunes, kings gave their years. The plain became an ocean of construction, hammers striking stone, chants echoing, dust rising like incense. But merit had become competition. Each new king sought to outshine his forebears, to build higher, brighter, heavier. And beneath the beauty, the soil began to groan. The monks who once whispered of moderation now found themselves surrounded by monuments, so vast they cast shadows even at noon. The devotion that once flowed like water had hardened into ritual, its current slowed by wealth. The people still prayed, still offered, still believed, but somewhere deep within, the simplicity of the old days had been replaced by spectacle. Faith had become architecture, and architecture had begun to crack. After the age of Kianzitha and Narathu, the throne passed through many hands, some noble, some forgettable, some cursed. King Alaungsithu, wise and long-lived, had tried to preserve order. He built bridges, expanded trade, and raised new temples that glimmered like suns. But even his reign saw whispers of rebellion along the river, local governors growing proud, monasteries amassing wealth untaxed, priests and princes arguing over the meaning of merit. When he died, his sons fought for succession. The court turned inward, more concerned with its own intrigues than with the shifting powers beyond the horizon. To the north, the great Mongol Empire was stirring. To the south, the Mon cities, long subdued, began to dream of independence. And around the edges of Bagan's vast realm, smaller tribes tested their strength. The Golden City was surrounded not by enemies, but by time itself, time in the form of change. The first tremor came not from the sky, but from the ground. One summer night, under a full moon, the plain began to shiver. Walls groaned, bells clanged out of rhythm, birds erupted from the trees. It was not a great quake, just a warning, but it cracked the plaster of temples, dislodged tiles, and sent dust cascading from ceilings painted with the faces of gods. The monks, waking in terror, gathered in the courtyards and recited the Metta Sutta, the prayer of loving kindness, their voices trembling as the earth rumbled beneath their feet. When the shaking stopped, silence returned thicker than before. They repaired the walls, repainted the murals, and whispered that the earth had spoken. But the lesson was forgotten as quickly as it came. Bagan continued to build, unaware that the very weight of its devotion was drawing it closer to ruin. In the year 1277, the sky above Bagan changed colour. Far to the north, a dust storm rose, not of sand, but of hooves. The armies of Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor of the Yuan dynasty, had begun their descent into Southeast Asia. They were not yet enemies, but envoys had been insulted, tributes refused, and pride wounded. The great Mongol machine did not forgive insult. King Narathi-Hapate, known to later generations as Taruk Pai Min, the king who fled from the Chinese, sat upon the throne. He was ambitious, quick-tempered, and utterly unprepared for the storm that was coming. When the Mongols demanded submission, he refused. He sent no tribute, only silence. A silence that, to the steppes, meant defiance. The first clash came near the northern frontier, at Ngasaungyan. The chronicles describe it briefly. The men of the north came like fire, our men fled like smoke. The Mongols advanced methodically, their cavalry slicing through the border towns. But even before they reached Bagan, panic had already arrived. Narathi-Hapate's reign became a mirror of everything that had gone wrong with Bagan. He built temples while his people starved, executed monks for defying him, and distrusted even his own sons. When word came that the Mongol scouts had crossed the Irrawaddy, the king ordered the palace abandoned. He fled south to Pathain, leaving the capital undefended. For this, history would remember him with a name of shame, the king who ran from the Chinese. But perhaps he did not flee from them. Perhaps he fled from the truth, that his empire, magnificent and devout, was hollow at its core. Behind him, the city waited. The monks continued their prayers. The people tended their fields, and the temples stood like silent witnesses, unaware that their golden age was already ending. The Mongols, finding little resistance, advanced cautiously, then withdrew. They had no need to conquer what was already collapsing. By the time Narathihabate returned, the damage was done. Revolts had broken out across the provinces. Trade routes had withered. The treasury was empty. And soon after, the king himself was betrayed, poisoned by his own son. Bagan had no king, no unity, and no direction, only temples. When power dissolves, faith lingers, but faith without guidance becomes silence. For the first time in centuries, no royal procession crossed the city at dawn. The palace gates were shut, the markets quiet. The monks continued their chants, but fewer voices joined them. Farmers fled upriver to safer lands, fearing raids from the north. The great monasteries, once sustained by royal grants, fell into disrepair. Statues lost their gilding, murals faded, roofs collapsed under the monsoon. And yet, amid the ruin the temples endured, stripped of luxury but still filled with presence. Travellers passing through in the years after the fall described Bagan as a city of ghosts where even the wind chants sutras. At dusk, they said, the spires glowed red in the dying light, and from afar one could mistake it for a city still alive, until one heard no footsteps, no laughter, only the slow coo of doves roosting in the domes. Then came the second quake, greater than the first. The chronicles say it struck in the early 1300s, long after the kings had gone. The ground rippled like water. Pagodas cracked open, their relic chambers spilling fragments of bone and scripture. The great spires that once caught the morning sun now leaned at strange angles, as if bowing in surrender. Those who survived said the sound of falling stupors was like thunder rolling through the earth. When the dust cleared, the air smelled of clay and fear. People began to whisper that the sky itself had turned against them, that Bagan's glory had become too heavy, its prayers too proud. They spoke of the Nats, the ancient spirits of the land, angered by neglect. They said the gods had reclaimed what men had borrowed. Whatever the reason, the tremors did what no invader could. They silenced Bagan. Not everyone left. Some monks refused to abandon the sacred plane. They believed that to leave would be to sever the chain of faith connecting heaven and earth. And so they stayed, patching walls, relighting candles, reciting sutras to empty halls. One inscription from that era survives, carved into the base of a ruined stupa. Even if the river leaves and the kings forget, the Dhamma remains. At night, these monks walked among the ruins, carrying lanterns made of paper and oil. The wind snuffed some out, but others endured, glowing softly against the brick, tiny flames holding back the sea of darkness. Perhaps they did not rebuild for themselves, but for us, for those who would one day return to listen. After the Mongols withdrew, after the quake subsided, Bagan did not die. It simply slept. For centuries it lay forgotten, half buried by dust, its temples eroded by wind and rain. Villages rose around them. Farmers tilled the soil between stupas, unaware that their ploughs traced lines where kings once walked. The Irrawaddy changed its course, leaving some pagodas stranded far from the water that once fed them. Many collapsed, their bricks carted away to build homes and roads. Yet even in decay, Bagan refused to vanish. Every morning, when sunlight returned to the plain, it touched the same stones that had witnessed both glory and ruin. The temples, though broken, still caught fire in gold. The people began to say that the Buddha still walked there at dawn, unseen, his reflection moving across the river like mist. History remembers the fall of Bagan as tragedy, but to those who lived through it, perhaps it was simply change, the turning of a great wheel. The Buddha taught that all compounded things must dissolve, even the greatest kingdom, even the purest faith. To hold on is suffering, to let go is wisdom. Bagan, in its silence, embodied that truth. It did not rage against its fate. It accepted it, gracefully, almost gratefully. The city that had once reached for the heavens now bowed to the earth, and in that bow lay its redemption. One morning, long after the kings had gone, a young novice was said to have climbed the ruined terrace of Shwezigon to light a lamp. The temple was cracked, the gold leaf faded, the stairway crumbling. As he struck the flint, the spark caught, and for a brief moment the flame reflected on the metal above. The entire dome glimmered, faint but enough to be seen from across the river. A fisherman, rowing at that hour, looked up and thought the sun had returned early. And so it is with Bagan. Even in ruin it continues to shine, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. The sky trembled, the earth split, the kings vanished, the monks thinned, the people scattered. But the prayers remained, suspended in the dust, waiting. Centuries later, when explorers and pilgrims would return to this plain, they would find that nothing truly sacred had been lost, only transformed. For in the fall of Bagan lies the very heart of its teaching. That impermanence is not destruction, but renewal. That even silence is a kind of song. And when the first light of dawn touches the Irrawaddy again, the city of temples, though broken, though humbled, still greets the sun, as it always has, as it always will. For even when the sky trembled, Bagan did not end. It simply learned how to bow. The fall of Bagan did not sound like thunder. It did not end with the crash of armies or the roar of fire. It ended with silence. A silence so deep that even the river seemed to hesitate before flowing past. When the last king had gone and the dust of battle settled, the city stood empty beneath a sky that no longer cared to shine. Temples still lined the horizon, countless and unmoving, their spires catching the wind like the ribs of a sleeping giant. But the songs, the laughter, the drums of festivals, all had vanished. Only the hum of insects and the rustle of dry grass remained, a lullaby for a civilization that had forgotten to wake. This was the beginning of the long stillness, the centuries when Bagan became not a city, but a memory adrift in time. At first, people stayed, a few monks, a few farmers, a few families too poor or too faithful to leave. They tried to live as before, sweeping the temple courtyards, tending the gardens, lighting the lamps each evening. But as seasons passed, the weeds grew faster than prayers. The canals silted, the reservoirs dried. Without royal patronage, the great monasteries could no longer feed their followers. Brick by brick, the smaller shrines began to crumble. Bats filled the corridors, where choirs once sang. Snakes slept in the cool shadows of the Buddha's feet. Yet even decay had its rhythm. When rain fell, it was gentle, washing the statues clean for a moment before disappearing into dust. When the sun returned, the temples glowed again, not with gold but with the muted warmth of old clay. Bagan was learning a new kind of beauty, the beauty of endurance. Each morning, mist rose from the river and drifted across the plain, wrapping the ruins in pale cloth. From a distance, The temples looked less like remnants and more like spirits, half there, half gone. The people began to say the city was dreaming, and that one should not wake a dream too soon. The Irrawaddy, that ancient storyteller, had carried the life of Bagan for centuries. But rivers are creatures of their own will. They move when they tire of their path. Sometime in those quiet centuries, the Irrawaddy shifted, carving a new channel, leaving parts of the city stranded far from water. Pagodas that once watched fishermen and traders now gazed out over empty plains. The river's whisper grew fainter. The pulse of commerce died. Without the river's embrace, Bagan lost not only its trade but its heartbeat. Boats no longer brought pilgrims or scrolls. The scent of spice and lacquer faded from the air. The city turned inward, feeding only on memory. The monks said it was the will of karma, the river returning to its natural course after centuries of human defiance. They told each other, all things flow away in time. And so the people accepted it, as they had accepted the fall, not with rebellion, but with bowed heads and open hands. Through the long silence, the monks remained, fewer each year, but never none. They became like the trees, gnarled and steadfast, growing from the cracks of temples they refused to abandon. They lived on rice given by passing travellers, on water drawn from wells dug by their ancestors. They patched walls with straw and mud, painted new faces over the fading ones, and whispered sutras into the hollow echoes of halls. To them, the ruins were not empty. They were full of lessons, full of echoes, full of the quiet certainty that the Dharma had not died. One old chronicle tells of a monk named Shin Thewali who lived alone in the upper cell of the Ananda temple. For 30 years he never left its walls. Each morning he lit a candle and placed it at the feet of the northern Buddha. When the candle burned out, he whispered, "Another day gone, another step nearer." When he finally died, the villagers found his body seated in meditation. The wax of his final candle hardened into a pool of light around him. No one rebuilt his cell. No one erased the marks of smoke on the wall, because in Bagan, decay itself had become a form of worship. By the 15th century, the plain had changed beyond recognition. Grass grew tall between stupas. Trees rooted themselves in cracks, their roots curling down the sides of the brick like fingers over a book left open. Monkeys swung from tower to tower, scattering dust like incense. The air was filled not with prayer, but with birdsong. Travellers who arrived from the east wrote of a city as large as a sea and as silent as the grave. They said it was impossible to count the temples, that the horizon was a maze of domes and spires fading into haze. At dawn, when the light spread across them, it looked as if the earth itself were covered in bells waiting to be rung. But no one came to ring them. The kings of the later centuries moved their capitals elsewhere, to Ava, to Inwa, to Mandalay. They took with them the craftsmen, the treasures, the stories. Bagan was left with only its bones. Yet those bones were enough. For centuries, pilgrims continued to wander here, a few at a time, drawn by rumours of sacred relics hidden in the ruins. They came at dusk, walking barefoot through grass wet with dew, and left before morning, leaving behind offerings of candles and flowers. The city did not speak to them in words. It breathed, slow, patient, forgiving. The earth of Bagan is red, iron-rich, dry, soft enough to crumble between your fingers. It is said that even when you dig deep, you find brick. Brick upon brick, layer upon layer, until the soil itself becomes an archive. Every century left its mark here. The tremor of an earthquake, the scorch of lightning, the print of a monk's foot pressed into clay. In time, these became one continuous memory, the ground remembering what men had forgotten. Sometimes, after heavy rain, the soil gives up its secrets. A fragment of fresco, a shard of glazed tile, a bronze bell. Each discovery is like a breath drawn after a long silence, the past exhaling. But for the people who lived among these ruins, such finds were not history, they were conversation. When they unearthed a statue, they would wash it, set it upright again, light a candle beside it, and whisper, "Welcome home." Bagan's silence was not untouched. The centuries brought storms, fires, and quakes. The earth shifted, temples split apart. One by one, the highest spires fell, leaving jagged crowns against the sky. But every time destruction came, someone repaired what they could, with fresh clay, with wood, with faith. A new brick beside an old one, a candle relit where a flame had died. The earthquakes of 1838 and 1975 shattered hundreds of monuments. The one in 2016 cracked more. Each tremor felt like the voice of history clearing its throat, reminding the living that nothing stands without care. And yet, in every photograph taken after, one could still see the same thing: the temples, wounded but unbowed, standing amid the rubble as if the earth itself were meditating. It is said that when the 1975 quake struck, a monk in the That Bayanu temple continued his chant even as the walls swayed. When asked later why he had not fled, he replied, "If the Buddha falls, I will fall with him." But he did not. There were times when Bagan seemed entirely forgotten. Colonial maps barely marked its name. Historians debated whether it had ever truly been an empire. To the outside world, it was a rumour, a ghost whispered by the river wind. But ghosts have patience. At night, when the moon rose above the plain, the temples shimmered as though remembering their former light. Owls perched on broken stupors, their eyes reflecting silver. The air was so still, you could hear the rustle of leaves falling onto stone. The villagers who lived nearby would tell their children that the temples were listening, that if you spoke too loudly, you might wake the old kings. So the children grew up whispering, and the city remained asleep. Sometimes a wandering monk would arrive, guided only by instinct. He would sweep a courtyard, light a candle, and recite a verse. Then, when his duty felt complete, he would leave, his footsteps fading like rain on dry earth. One life, one flame, one moment of remembrance, enough to keep the silence alive. And then one morning, centuries after the world had forgotten, light returned. Not just the light of the sun, but of attention. Scholars from faraway lands came with notebooks and compasses. They traced the lines of temples half buried in sand, measured their symmetry, and marveled that such precision could exist in a world without machines. They uncovered murals hidden beneath soot, revealing colours still vivid after 700 years. They found inscriptions carved in languages long dead, prayers preserved by chants. And as they worked, they began to realise what the monks had always known, that Bagan had never truly fallen asleep. It had merely been waiting for someone to listen again. The first visitors described it as a silence you can see. They wrote of the light at sunrise, how it moved across the plain like a tide of gold, touching each temple in turn. They wrote of the monks, still walking barefoot through the dust, their robes bright against the muted earth. They wrote of how, even in ruin, Bagan possessed a calm that felt like forgiveness. The world began to listen. The silence that followed Bagan's fall was not absence, it was transformation. In the quiet, the city learned to exist without ownership. No king claimed it, no army guarded it. It belonged only to wind, to rain, to time. And because of that, it endured. Its solitude became its shield. While other capitals burned and vanished, Bagan remained, humbled but whole. Its temples weathered but standing, its faith stripped of grandeur but purer than ever. For silence, too, is a teacher. It teaches patience, humility, and the art of seeing what is left when everything else has gone. In Bagan's stillness, the monks and the wind became indistinguishable. The earth breathed where prayers once rose, and in that breath the city continued, not alive, not dead, simply present. When dawn comes to Bagan now, it comes softly. The mist rises from the river, wrapping each stupa in veils of silver. From afar, the plain looks as it must have 1,000 years ago, eternal, unchanging, yet always new. The first light touches the Shwezigon, then Ananda, then the thousands of lesser shrines that sleep between. Each catches the sun for a moment before passing it on to the next, like a relay of memory. It is said that if you stand still enough at sunrise, you can hear the faintest sound, not the wind, not the birds, but the echo of chanting from long ago, travelling still through the dust. That is the voice of Bagan's silence, the song it learned after the kings departed, the melody it hums to itself when no one is listening. And when the day grows bright and tourists arrive, when drones buzz above and footsteps echo in the halls, the city remains patient. It knows that all noise fades. It has seen empires rise and vanish like ripples on the Irrawaddy. Bagan waits for evening, when the last visitor leaves, when the last bell stops ringing, when the sun sets and the plain glows once more in bronze and shadow. Only then does it breathe again, whispering to the stars, the same words it has whispered for 1,000 years. All things return, all things change, and in silence, everything is remembered. For centuries, Bagan slept like a constellation fallen to earth, its stars of brick dimmed beneath dust, its stories folded into silence. The river changed its course. Kings rose and departed elsewhere. Wind and rain took the long task of caretaking into their patient hands. And yet dawn still visited the plain each morning, stroking spires and domes as if reassuring them. I remember you. Light was the first rediscoverer, long before scholars, long before maps. It arrived every day, unannounced, laying a path across the roofs of temples, slipping through broken doors, drawing frescoes out of darkness for a few tender minutes before vanishing again. In that rhythm, Bagan waited. One day, travellers followed that same path of light. They came at first as wanderers with notebooks, surveyors, missionaries, traders and dreamers, men and women whose curiosity was larger than their destinations. In their journals, the city returned to the world, a place of 1,000 spires emerging from mist, of corridors where bats whispered like prayer wheels, of monks who kept candles for strangers as if tending small suns. They tried to count the temples. They failed. Instead, they counted the ways the light moved, down stairwells, along terraces, inside the hollows of Buddhas whose faces still shone through soot. They sketched outlines by hand, their pencils tracing what time had softened. Some carried away shards of glazed tile to keep on shelves, a personal constellation. Others left with nothing but silence pressed into memory. The plain received them without surprise. It had known visitors before, merchants and pilgrims, envoys and enemies. These newcomers were different only in the tool they carried: the line, the lens, the language of measurement. They compared arches, catalogued scripts, paced out foundations. Their footsteps drew invisible grids over the sleeping map of Bagan. Yet even as they sought to understand the city with numbers, the city spoke to them in something older. When they stepped into the cool, dim belly of a great temple after hours in the sun, they felt what every pilgrim of every age had felt. The body loosen, the breath slow, the world soften around the edges. They wrote of a hush that thinks and a stillness that consoles. They learned quickly that Bagan could not be described without listening first. Word spread. More came, linguists to rub charcoal over inscriptions and lift letters from stone, painters to copy murals before colour dissolved into wall, architects to trace invisible geometries of vault and lintel, photographers to pin light onto paper, a fragile promise against forgetting. Their plates and films caught the city in silver and sepia, columns like reeds in shallow water, doorways opening into long corridors of shadow, an endless horizon of red earth beaded with stupas. Villagers watched these strangers with a gentle curiosity of their own. They knew the plain in ways that no survey could, which temples stayed cool in summer, which wells kept sweet water, which statues received the earliest sun. They guided the visitors along goat paths and river shortcuts, and sometimes farther, to the corners of grief and grace that never make the map. In exchange, the scholars left medicines, lamps, notebooks, or simply stories from other worlds, which the children repeated to each other among the stupas at dusk. The more the world looked, the more it saw that Bagan was not a ruin but a library, a place where texts were written in brick and breath. A fresco in a side chamber was not decoration, it was sermon and memory and law. A broken finial, when lifted, revealed the tiny reliquary hidden within. Even the fingerprints in mortar spoke, the anonymous signature of hands that once believed. In the quiet neighbourhood of monasteries still alive, monks received these visitors with bowls of tea and patience. They led them by lamplight to rooms never shown to crowds, where soot-black walls suddenly bloomed with faint figures under the tremble of flame. River journeys, forest sermons, celestial palaces drawn not for spectacle, but instruction of the heart. Here, the scholars were students again, their pencils lowered, their attention lifted. Rumour turned to recognition. The city re-entered the world as a sacred landscape, a testament that devotion can leave durable form. New arrivals shifted from speculation to stewardship. The question sharpened: how to care for a place built of prayer, how to protect clay from the caress of time without silencing time's voice, how to keep dawn moving freely across the bricks while guiding footsteps that might wear them thin. Conservation became a new kind of faith. Some argued for restoration, to return broken stupas to what they had been. Others urged restraint, to let scars remain as the truest text. Between these positions lay a narrow path where humility and technique held hands. Craftsmen learned again the old recipes, earth and straw, lime and patience, the weight of a hand on a cooling brick. Engineers measured tremble and tilt, listening to what the foundations confessed at night. Monks offered the rhythm that had survived every century: sweep at dawn, bless at dusk, repair what can be mended, release what must be let go. The river watched, amused perhaps, as boats returned with tools and timber. Dust rose again on the roads, but now from wheelbarrows and careful scaffolds. Children learned new words: plumb, vault, shear, limewash, and added them to older ones like merit and relic, as if a bilingual temple were forming in their mouths. The plain, long accustomed to memory, allowed the present to sit at its side. Morning remained its most gentle hour. From the hills you could see the quiet choreography of care. Tiny figures moved along the terraces, setting new earthen tiles where monsoons had eaten the old. Ropes ringed a leaning spire. Beneath them, a mason laid brick with slow, deliberate joy, each placement a sentence finished. On a nearby wall, a conservator brushed away a century of smoke, revealing the face of a deer with eyes the colour of patient water. The deer had always been there, but only now returned to the world of sight. With attention came celebration and the risk that follows it. Visitors arrived by the hundreds, then thousands, carrying cameras and sleep and longing. They sought the sunrise that countless unknown hearts had once sought, simply by awakening. Balloons rose with them, bright lanterns cupping the morning, drifting between spires as if the sky itself were curious. For a few minutes each day, the city floated not only in time, but in air. The monks smiled at the spectacle and then went on sweeping. They had seen other ages, other kinds of brightness. They did not mistake seeing for knowing. In their calm, the plain found its balance. While shutters clicked and guides pointed, a bell rang from somewhere no one was looking, summoning novices to lessons. A boy slipped his hand into his grandmother's, and she told him to bow before stepping through a doorway where the Buddha's gaze met the sun's. Not all attention was gentle. From time to time, the earth reminded the living that its bones still move. A tremor, a crack along a beloved curve, a finial shaken loose. The sound of a dome's small collapse travelled farther than any advertisement, and many arrived not to take pictures, but to help lift, to steady, to listen. In those hours, the plain behaved as a village does after storm, tasks divided without instruction, grief and work spoken in the same quiet voice. The lesson was not pride but proportion, that every touch must be equal parts love and knowledge. Recognition ripened into protection. Elders traced invisible boundaries in the air, then marked them in law, not to encircle the city like a museum piece, but to make space for its breathing, for monks to walk, for winds to pass, for pilgrims to kneel without stumbling over sail. Regulations and rites learned to live side by side. A market table retreated 2 paces from a fragile stair, a path bent gently around wildflowers reclaiming a fallen wall. The plain taught flexibility and the law learned. Meanwhile, scholars gathered Bagan's scattered speech. In libraries far away, palm leaf manuscripts, once thought too humble to save, were cleaned and copied, their brittle threads of string replaced. In basements, boxes of old rubbings became new books. On laptops and light tables, sketches became models. Models became care. Care became another morning with the deer's patient eyes the colour of water restored. The city's text, fragmented across centuries, began to read again, end to end. And still, the deepest rediscovery remained dawn. If you rise before the crowds and stand on the low edge of a field, you will feel it. The moment when the air loosens its night cool and the outlines of towers draw their first breath. In that breathing, rediscovery happens anew, not as a project, but as an intimacy. You are alone and not alone. A farmer, already at work, lifts his face to judge the light. A novice, late to his round, hushes his sandals so the gravel will not wake the temple he is about to enter. A pair of cranes lifts from a roofline and writes a white sentence across the pale sky. The sentence says, "Again." Again the plain receives its portion of day. Again the city reveals what it has always been. Not a relic of triumph, but a practice of tenderness. Again the thousands of spires are not counted, but cherished. Again, someone new learns that to place a palm on warm brick is to feel a century pass, through one hand and out the other like a stream. At night lamps return, fewer than the cameras at noon, but steadier. Elders sit with children and tell them which temple their great-grandmother helped repair after a storm, which lintel their uncle carved in the year of flood, which field once held a shrine that now exists only in a story. The children listen as if to weather, and it is weather, of a kind, the climate of belonging. In this way, rediscovery becomes inheritance rather than intrusion. What has the city learned in its second life? That care is slower than curiosity, but lasts longer. That faith can be translated into scaffolding and still remain faith. That a crack, honestly mended, is also a kind of text. That the wind, which once removed, now returns, carrying laughter and vows from places where the Buddha's name is pronounced in unfamiliar music. It lays those sounds down gently among the stupas, and by morning they have become local, like everything else that survives here. What have we learned from the city in return? That nothing is ever truly found for the first time. We are always joining a conversation begun before us. That history is not a chain of victories, but a field of breath. That to rediscover is not to possess, but to be invited. To arrive as one arrives at a threshold, with shoes in hand and head bowed to a silence that is already speaking. You cannot step into this plane without becoming, briefly, a caretaker. Even to stand very still is to protect the ground beneath your feet from being asked to bear more than it can. Even to exhale softly in the cool interior of a temple is to share the bowl of air with the flames of small candles, to agree to keep them alive for as long as you are there. Rediscovery is not spectacle then, but service, and the city receives it as such. There will be other mornings, other tremors, other restorations. Attention will wax and wane. Rules will be written and rewritten. Balloons will rise and be banned and rise again. Hands will change, but the kindness in good work will not. The river will alter its mind another inch, and someone will move a path to follow it. A child who listened tonight will lead a visitor tomorrow to a mural only he has noticed. And in that exchange, both will be enlarged. At last, when evening pools in the fields and the last sun thins across the terraces, the plain remembers its oldest language. Lamps appear, slow as stars. A monk sets a bowl of water at a shrine for birds. A woman closes her market cloth and pauses to bow toward a doorway older than her grandmother's grandmother. Wind tastes briefly of jasmine and ash. The city's edges blur until it is not a place, but a way of seeing. Brick and breath, dust and light. Rediscovered by scholars, preserved by law, revived by labour, Bagan is most truly rediscovered each time someone chooses gentleness here. A hand at a wall steadies rather than leans. A voice lowers. A foot hesitates before the threshold and then enters with grace. In such small acts, the city completes its circle, from glory to silence, to a new kind of radiance. And when night comes, it comes as it always has, soft, inevitable, the great cloak of rest. The temples do not resist. They receive darkness as they receive dawn, with composure, with welcome, with the knowledge that both are necessary to make meaning. Above them, constellations write their old scripts. Below, on the river's slow skin, the moon lays a trembling path that leads toward morning. For in Bagan, rediscovery is simply the daily fact that light returns. And when it returns, the city does not shout. It opens its eyes, which were never fully closed, and allows the world to remember, gently, truly again. There are cities that survive through conquest, and cities that survive through memory. Bagan survives through light. Even now, 1,000 years after its first foundations, the sun still finds its way through the corridors of its temples exactly as it once did. The same angle, the same silence, the same breath of dust. The world has changed around it, but the light remains loyal. Perhaps that is what time remembers best, not the noise of history, but the way light touches what endures quietly. Bagan has had many names. Aramadana, the land where enemies are crushed. Pukam, the place of dry plains, city of 4 million pagodas, city of silence, city of dust. But to those who have stood here at dawn, it has only one name, the place where the sky still kneels to the earth. When you walk through Bagan today, you walk not through ruins, but through layers of time folded upon themselves like cloth. The first layer is the present, the smell of morning tea, the hum of scooters carrying monks to alms rounds, the sound of sandals brushing against temple dust. The second is the near past, the scaffolds of restoration, the voices of guides, the drone of distant cameras tracing patterns above the spires. The third, quieter still, is the ancient pulse, a rhythm that has not changed in 1,000 years. Brick and breath, faith and silence. Time here is not linear. It drifts, it pools in shadows, evaporates in heat, condenses again in mist. It does not move forward, it circles, like the monks walking 3 times clockwise around a pagoda. Their motion, both repetition and renewal. You begin to understand that time itself has become a pilgrim in Bagan, wandering among its own memories, bowing to its own creation. For all its centuries of solitude, Bagan is not a monument to the dead. It lives through the hands of those who continue to touch it. A boy sweeping dust from a stairway each dawn, his broom rising and falling with the same rhythm as the river. An old woman lighting oil lamps, whispering a prayer for her husband who died long ago, though she no longer remembers his voice. A craftsman mixing clay by moonlight, shaping bricks for a temple that will never carry his name. They are the same souls reborn into new forms, repeating old gestures without needing to know why. Their devotion is practical, patient, unremarkable, and therefore eternal. Every act of care becomes a continuation of history. Every breath taken within a temple renews its purpose. And in this way, the city keeps living, not because it resists time, but because it accepts it completely. The Irrawaddy has seen everything. It carried kings and armies, monks and manuscripts, traders and tears. It has flooded and withdrawn, changed its course, erased and rewritten its own banks. If you sit beside it at dusk, you can hear its voice, not loud but steady. It murmurs against the stones, retelling the story of the plain in syllables of water, rise, fall, flow, return. Sometimes at low tide, pieces of old brick emerge from its mud, fragments of stupors once swallowed by the river's wandering. Children collect them, thinking they are treasures. In truth they are, pieces of prayer shaped by hands that no longer exist, now rounded and softened by centuries of current. The monks say that the river is the truest historian, because it forgets nothing, yet forgives everything. It does not mourn the past, it carries it forward, turning ruin into rhythm. And in that way, Bagan too survives, not as monument, but as movement. In Bagan, dust is not decay, it is conversation. It gathers on the floor of temples, dances in sunlight, coats the skin of statues, settles on offerings of flowers and rice. Each grain carries a trace of someone who once lived here. A breath, a fingerprint, a moment of waiting. When the wind rises, it lifts those grains and scatters them across the plain, mixing centuries together in one soft gesture. It is said that when you walk through the temples at midday, barefoot, the dust that clings to your feet contains particles of every age, from the bricklayers of Anil-Rachta's reign, to the pilgrims of the 20th century, to the monks who will chant tomorrow. You do not just walk on history here, you walk with it, and when you wash your feet in the river at day's end, that dust returns to the water, beginning its long circle again, one endless migration of memory. Every civilization tries to speak across time, in stone, in ink, in sound. Bagan speaks in stillness. Its message is not carved but breathed. It does not instruct, it invites. It asks nothing but attention. When you stand beneath a vaulted roof and look upward, you realize the builders designed for silence as carefully as they designed for light. The acoustics are deliberate. A single cough can echo for seconds. A chant can fill the space with vibration long after the voice has stopped. Sound becomes visible here. It hangs in the air like dust, catching sunlight as it fades. And in that moment, you understand what the people of Bagan always knew, that silence is not absence, but presence beyond sound, a reminder that even the breath between words has meaning. Bagan's greatest lesson is not its beauty, but its acceptance of impermanence. Every brick that crumbles, every crack in the plaster, every collapsed spire is a sermon. Nothing resists time forever, nor should it. The Buddha taught that all compounded things are subject to dissolution, that the true measure of faith is not in what endures, but in what is released gracefully. And yet here, impermanence is not despair, it is music. The temples decay not as punishment but as performance, a slow choreography of surrender. The rain writes its verses on their walls each monsoon. The wind erases them each dry season. Together they compose an endless dialogue, a duet between endurance and release. When you look at Bagan, you do not see loss. You see the art of letting go beautifully. Today, pilgrims still arrive, though they carry cameras instead of incense. Some come for wonder, others for peace, others without knowing why. They rise before dawn, climb a hill, and wait as the first light unfurls across the plain. For a moment the world holds its breath. The spires ignite in gold, the mist thins into silver, and the air itself seems to chant. No matter where they come from, every pilgrim feels the same thing. A stillness settling in the chest, a recognition beyond words. It is the same stillness that generations before them once called faith. And when the sun climbs higher and the crowds begin to scatter, a few remain behind, sitting quietly among the stupas. They do not pray, they simply listen. The wind carries a faint murmur of chanting from a distant monastery, mingled with the cry of birds. It sounds like the past breathing through the present. That is when rediscovery becomes remembrance, not of something lost, but of something that was always here, waiting to be heard again. In most places, time is a thief. In Bagan, it is a companion. You can feel it walking beside you as you cross the plain, invisible, barefoot, unhurried. It has seen empires rise like storms and vanish like mist. It has watched men build towers to defy it, only to crumble into its arms. And still it keeps walking, steady, gentle, without malice. Bagan has made peace with it. Here the past does not accuse the present. The present does not mourn the past. They coexist, like sunlight and shadow on the same wall. At sunset you can see it most clearly. Half the temples glowing with gold, the other half dark in the fading light. Together they form one image, complete only in contrast. It is the same with history. It is the same with life. So what remains after 1,000 years of prayer and ruin? Not empire, not wealth, not certainty. What remains are gestures, a candle lit in darkness, a hand smoothing dust from a Buddha's face, a monk's chant echoing into air that no longer needs it but welcomes it anyway. What remains are shapes, the curve of an arch, the slope of a dome, the stillness of eyes half closed in stone. Shapes that catch the same light each morning and offer it back to the sky without complaint. What remains is tenderness, the kind that builds, that forgives, that endures without demanding recognition. And perhaps that is what the builders meant all along, that paradise was never a destination, but a rhythm, a pulse in the brick, a shimmer in the river, a silence that remembers how to breathe. Every evening, when the sun descends behind the western hills, the plain exhales, the temples glow in bronze and then fade to shadow. The air cools, the birds return to their towers, and for a moment the city seems to vanish into the colour of the earth. But even then, it is not darkness that wins, for just as the last light leaves the spires, the first lamps are lit, small flames trembling at the feet of statues, mirroring the stars that now bloom above. The cycle continues, unbroken, light becoming shadow, shadow becoming light. Somewhere, a monk begins to chant. His voice travels through the corridors, across the fields, through the open doors of ruined stupas. It joins the river's murmur, the whisper of wind, the breath of those who still listen. And when dawn returns, as it always does, the same light will slide once more over the same bricks, and the same silence will open its eyes. Because in Bagan, nothing truly ends. The kings have gone, the wars forgotten, the empires turn to sand, but the light, the river, the prayer, and the dust still move together in harmony. That is what remains in time, not what was built, but what continues to awaken. If the night has carried you here, and if your thoughts have wandered across the plains of time, you have walked among ruins that are not truly ruins. You have seen the breath of stone, the patience of dust, and the kindness of a city that never asked to be remembered, only to be understood. Bagan has survived every season of forgetting because it never fought to be known. It endured by listening, by bowing to time instead of resisting it, by allowing silence to become its voice and light to become its memory. It began as a fortress, became a kingdom, and finally, a prayer. And like all true prayers, it does not end when the words stop. It lingers in the air, soft and invisible, long after the lips have closed. When you stand upon its fields at dawn, the horizon rippling with mist and gold, you realize that the city is not ancient at all. It is awake right now, breathing with you. The same light that touched the face of Anaurachta's temples now touches yours. The same wind that carried the chant of monks now carries the sound of your own heartbeat. And in that quiet recognition, the distance between centuries disappears. The story of Bagan is not a tale of conquest or ruin. It is a meditation on what remains when everything else fades, when kings are forgotten, when gold is gone, when only clay and devotion are left to speak. It reminds us that endurance does not come from strength but from gentleness. That beauty is not in perfection but in patience. It teaches that nothing, not even silence, is empty. That within stillness there is breath, within impermanence, peace, within decay, the soft pulse of becoming, and that perhaps the truest form of eternity is to accept the passing of all things without closing one's heart. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, let the memory of Bagan move gently through your mind. Imagine the plain before sunrise, thousands of spires dissolving in mist, each holding one small flame, the air cool and fragrant with incense, the monks chanting in the distance, their voices blending with the hum of insects and the slow sigh of the river, the first light rising from the east, touching each temple in turn, as though reminding them it is time to wake again. And as that light grows, you can almost feel the whole plain breathing, the same breath that once rose from the hearts of kings and farmers, sculptors and monks, the same breath that continues now through you. For this is what Bagan leaves us with, not answers but rhythm, not history but harmony, the sound of oars on the Irrawaddy, the rustle of leaves across cracked stone, the whisper of a candle's flame trembling against the wind. If you listen long enough, you may hear it, the city speaking softly through its silence. Everything passes, everything returns. Remember and let go beautifully. Thank you for listening. I wish you a peaceful, restful night, and I look forward to seeing you again on our next journey through history.